Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The headlights of my Ford pickup swept across the driveway as I pulled in around 11 that Thursday night in October. I'd been putting in overtime at the warehouse for weeks, trying to save up enough to finally fix the roof before winter hit Colorado Springs hard. My wife Diane had taken the kids to her mother's place in Denver for the week, something about needing space to think about our marriage, which left me alone in that old two-story house my father had left me when he passed in 2014. The silence in the empty house had been getting to me lately, so I'd been staying late at work just to avoid it. As I cut the engine and grabbed my thermos from the passenger seat, movement in my peripheral vision made me pause. Someone was standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly still, just watching my house like they were studying it for a test. It took me a second to recognize him in the darkness, but when I did, my whole body tensed up like I'd touched a live wire. Craig Novak, my next-door neighbor from before everything went to hell, was standing there in a worn denim jacket and jeans that hung loose on his frame. Prison had taken at least 30 pounds off him, and his hair, which used to be this wild mane he was so proud of, was now buzz-cut short and gray at the temples. He must have gotten out recently because I hadn't seen him around, and trust me, I would have noticed. The last time I'd seen Craig was 7 years ago when they loaded him into the police car after what he did. That night changed everything for my family. My dad never fully recovered from the head injury Craig gave him with that baseball bat during his drunken rampage, and watching him deteriorate over the following years, until his death was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to endure. I stayed in the truck for a moment, keys in my fist, debating whether to just back out and drive somewhere else until he left. But this was my house, my property, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me on my own land. When I stepped out, Craig raised both hands in this slow, deliberate way, palms facing me like he was trying to calm a spooked horse. The porch light from his house cast these long shadows across his face, making the hollows under his cheekbones look deeper than they probably were. He'd always been a big guy, the kind who used his size to get his way in arguments. But now there was something different about how he carried himself, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. The October wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the asphalt between us, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something else on him, maybe cheap cologne trying to mask something worse. Craig took a step forward, still keeping his hands visible, and his voice came out rougher than I remembered, like he'd been gargling gravel. He said he'd been out for 3 weeks, staying at a halfway house downtown at first, but he'd moved back into his old place just yesterday because his mother had kept up the payments while he was gone. The old woman had died 2 years into his sentence, he told me, but she'd made sure he had somewhere to come back to. He kept talking, saying he'd found God inside, that he was in AA now, that he understood what he'd taken from me and my family. Every word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror 100 times. He wanted to make amends, he said, part of his 12-step program, and he pulled out this crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, holding it out to me like it was supposed to mean something. I didn't move to take it, just stood there with my truck door still open behind me, ready to bolt if necessary. The paper fluttered in his hand as the wind picked up again, and I could see writing on it, probably some letter his sponsor made him write or something. Craig's eyes kept darting between my face and the ground, never quite settling on either. And there was this twitch in his left cheek that hadn't been there before. When I didn't take the paper, he slowly lowered his hand and shoved it back in his pocket. But he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about my dad, about how he remembered him working on cars in the garage on weekends, how he used to wave when Craig jogged by in the mornings before everything went bad. He said my father was a good man who didn't deserve what happened, and that he thought about that night every single day in his cell. The streetlight buzzed overhead, casting this sickly orange glow over everything, and I noticed Craig's knuckles were scarred in ways they hadn't been before, covered in these white lines that looked like a roadmap of violence. I finally found my voice and told him to get off my property, that whatever program he was working didn't require my participation or forgiveness. My words came out steadier than I felt, but my jaw was clenched so tight I could hear my teeth grinding. Craig nodded like he'd expected this, backing away with his hand still raised, saying he understood, that he'd be next door if I ever wanted to talk. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. He mentioned he'd noticed my tool shed door had been open earlier that day when he was moving boxes in, and he'd closed it for me to keep animals out. I hadn't been home all day, and I always locked that shed because that's where I kept my father's tools, the ones he'd collected over 40 years of working construction. The thought of Craig anywhere near those tools, touching things that belonged to my dad, made me want to put my fist through something. After he disappeared into his house, I went straight to the shed with my phone flashlight, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. The padlock was still there, locked like I'd left it that morning, but when I opened it and stepped inside, something was wrong. The tools were all there, hanging on their designated hooks just like my father had organized them. But his favorite hammer, the Estwing with the leather-wrapped handle he'd bought in 1975, was on the workbench instead of its hook. A thin layer of dust on the bench showed the outline where it had been placed recently. My father never left tools out, and neither did I. It was like muscle memory to put everything back exactly where it belonged. I picked up the hammer, feeling its familiar weight, and noticed something else. There were fresh scratches on the wooden handle, like someone had been gripping it too tight or maybe practicing swinging it. The next few days passed in this weird state of hypervigilance where I found myself checking locks twice, 3 times, before leaving for work. I installed a cheap security camera from Walmart, one of those that sends alerts to your phone, pointing it at the shed and driveway. Craig kept his distance, but I'd see him sometimes through the kitchen window, sitting on his porch smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing, or at least pretending to. Then things started disappearing. First, it was small stuff I could almost explain away. The garden hose nozzle I knew I'd left attached was gone, then showed up 2 days later, hanging on Craig's fence like it had been there all along. A pair of work gloves vanished from my truck bed, then appeared stuffed in my mailbox, damp with morning dew. Each time I thought about confronting him, but what would I say? That I was pretty sure he was stealing things just to return them. The police would laugh me out of the station. The security camera started picking up movement at night, but never anything definitive. Just shadows at the edge of its range, or sometimes a blur that could have been a cat or raccoon. But one night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the notification sound and checked my phone to see Craig standing in my driveway, completely still, facing my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there in pajama pants and a white t-shirt, barefoot despite the near-freezing temperature. I watched him through the live feed for 20 minutes and he never moved once, not even to shift his weight. His eyes were open but unfocused, and for a moment I wondered if he was sleepwalking. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, he turned and walked back to his house, moving normally like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in my living room with my father's old shotgun across my lap, watching the windows. I called Diane the next morning, trying to keep my voice casual as I told her maybe she should stay at her mother's a bit longer. She asked if everything was all right, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice, but I just said work was crazy, and I didn't want the kids to see me so stressed. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. How could I explain that our ex-con neighbor was playing some psychological game that I couldn't quite prove? The night after that phone call, my motion sensor lights kept triggering, one after another in sequence, like someone was walking circles around my house. Front porch, side yard, back deck, other side, then front porch again. Each time I looked out, nobody was there, but I could smell cigarette smoke through the cracked window, that same brand Craig had been chain-smoking on his porch. The camera only showed empty yards and swaying shadows from the trees, but those lights didn't trigger from wind. Then came that Saturday morning. I'd actually managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming paranoia. when I heard something scratching at the front door. Not knocking, scratching like a dog wanting to be let in. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there, but there was something white on the porch. I grabbed the shotgun, checked through all the windows to make sure Craig wasn't lurking nearby, then cracked the door open. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded once, weighted down with a rock from my own garden. My mouth went dry as I picked it up and read the single line written in pencil, the handwriting shaky like someone had written it with their non-dominant hand. I still remember that night too. That's all it said, but it was enough to make my knees weak. Because Craig had been blackout drunk that night 7 years ago. So drunk he claimed in court, he didn't remember anything about attacking my father. His whole defense had been built on that claim, that he had no memory of breaking down our back door and coming after my dad with the bat from my own garage. I went straight to Craig's house, not even bothering to put on shoes, pounding on his door hard enough to shake the frame. When he answered, he looked genuinely confused, his hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd just woken up. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, looking for all the world like any harmless middle-aged man on a Saturday morning. When I shoved the note in his face demanding to know what kind of sick game he was playing, he squinted at it, then looked back at me with what seemed like real bewilderment. He swore he didn't write it, said he'd been at his AA meeting until late last night and had his sponsor's number if I wanted to verify. He even offered to show me his notebook where he kept his step work, holding it out with hands that weren't shaking at all. The handwriting in his notebook was completely different, neat and precise where the note's writing was chaotic. But when he reached for the note to look at it closer, I saw something that made everything else fade away. Under his fingernails there was dust, the same distinctive reddish construction dust that covered everything in my father's tool shed. I backed away from his door without saying another word, my mind racing faster than my feet as I crossed back to my property. Craig called after me, asking what was wrong, still playing his innocent act. But I didn't turn around. Inside my house, I called my old friend Tom, who worked for the sheriff's department, told him everything that had been happening, including the dust under Craig's nails. Tom listened without interrupting, then said something that changed everything. There had been 3 other reports in the past 2 weeks from families in the neighborhood, all describing similar experiences with items being moved, notes being left, someone standing in their yards at night. The thing was, Craig had solid alibis for all of those incidents, verified by multiple witnesses at his halfway house or AA meetings. Tom asked me to check something, to look for any medications in my bathroom that might have been moved or tampered with. That's when I found it. My prescription sleep medication that I'd stopped taking months ago was nearly empty when it should have been almost full. Tom came by that afternoon with another detective, and they found something I'd never have thought to look for. There were small holes drilled in the fence between Craig's yard and mine, painted over to match the wood, but positioned perfectly to watch my house from his bedroom window. They also found a journal in Craig's room, hidden inside an old heating vent, where he'd documented everything about our family for years before he went to prison, including detailed observations about my father's routines, my work schedule, even notes about which lights we left on at night. The really sick part was that he'd been planning this since before he got out, had written about how he was going to make me understand what it felt like to lose someone slowly, to watch them deteriorate like my father had. But he'd been smart about it, making sure he had alibis, probably using the sleep medication he'd been stealing to make sure I'd be groggy enough not to catch him. The dust under his nails was his only mistake, probably from his last visit to the shed that morning before I confronted him. They arrested Craig that evening for criminal harassment, breaking and entering, and theft of prescription medication. As they led him to the police car, he didn't say a word, just stared at me with this blank expression that was somehow worse than anger would have been. His lawyer got him a plea deal for 2 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment, which seemed like nothing compared to what he'd put me through. But at least it got him away from my family. I changed all the locks, installed a real security system, and patched every one of those holes in the fence myself. Diane and the kids came home the following week, and I told her everything, showed her the police reports and the photos of Craig's journal. She held me for a long time that night, both of us realizing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't noticed that dust under his fingernails. The house feels different now, even with Craig gone. Sometimes I still check the locks 3 times before bed, and I replaced every tool in that shed. Couldn't stand touching the ones he'd handled. But the worst part is knowing he'll get out again someday, and that journal showed he's patient enough to wait years for his revenge. Tom told me Craig's obsession started because my father had called the cops on him once for a domestic dispute years before the attack, something I never even knew about. Such a small thing that led to all of this. I've been teaching Diane how to use the security system and bought her pepper spray for her keychain. We're thinking about moving, maybe somewhere across town or even out of state. But for now, we're taking it one day at a time. At least now I know I wasn't losing my mind, that every instinct telling me something was wrong had been right. Sometimes that's all you can hold on to, the knowledge that you trusted yourself when it mattered most. The cardboard boxes were still stacked against the living room wall when Brandon first knocked on our door that September afternoon. My roommate Kevin and I had just signed the lease 3 days earlier, desperate to find something affordable after our previous landlord decided to sell. The place on Willow Court wasn't much to look at, just a standard 2-bedroom in a complex built sometime during the Reagan administration, but the rent was manageable and it was only 20 minutes from both our jobs. Kevin answered the door while I was untangling Ethernet cables, and I heard this overly enthusiastic voice introducing himself as our across-the-hall neighbor. When I walked over to say hello, Brandon was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, grinning like we were long-lost relatives at a family reunion. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into khakis that looked like they'd been ironed with military precision, and he had this way of maintaining eye contact for just a beat too long. Kevin and I exchanged glances while Brandon launched into a detailed history of every tenant who'd lived in our unit for the past 6 years. He knew their names, their jobs, where they'd moved afterward, even what kind of car the previous couple drove. The casserole dish grew heavy in his hands as he talked, but he never set it down, just kept holding it out like an offering, while describing how quiet the building usually was, how the mail carrier came at exactly 2:15 every day except Sundays, how the dumpsters got emptied on Wednesdays at 6 in the morning sharp. When he finally handed over the casserole and left, Kevin immediately Googled whether you could hide cameras in food. We laughed about it then, joking that we'd already found the complex's resident weirdo. The casserole was actually pretty good, some kind of chicken and rice thing with too much cheese, and we figured Brandon was just lonely. Lots of single middle-aged guys get awkward around people, especially younger folks who remind them of what they used to be. Neither of us touched the second casserole he brought the next day. The gifts started appearing about a week later. First, it was a 6-pack of craft beer left on our doormat with a sticky note that said, "Noticed you guys carrying Sierra Nevada upstairs. Thought you might enjoy these." The thing was, we'd carried those beers up at 11:30 at night after a late grocery run. Then came the magazine subscriptions we never ordered, all addressed to us, but clearly paid for by someone else. Sports Illustrated for Kevin because Brandon had seen him wearing a Lakers jersey once. Wired for me after he'd spotted an old Arduino kit through our window when the blinds were cracked. Each gift came with these little notes demonstrating just how much attention he was paying to our daily routines. He knew Kevin left for his shift at the hospital at 6:45 each morning. He knew I worked from home on Fridays and always ordered Thai food from the place on Riverside Drive. The notes were always cheerful, always signed with a smiley face, always written in this perfect elementary school teacher handwriting that made my neck tense up. Kevin started keeping a log after Brandon showed up at his gym across town. Not the community center 5 minutes away, not the Planet Fitness by the grocery store, but the specific CrossFit box in Northside where Kevin had been going for months before we moved. Brandon claimed it was pure coincidence. Said his cousin had recommended the place, but he somehow ended up in Kevin's same morning class 3 days in a row. He'd position himself at the next station during circuits, offering form tips and asking about Kevin's workout history, his diet, whether I ever joined him for sessions. The owner told Kevin that Brandon had specifically asked about the schedule for the tall black guy who drives the blue Mazda before signing up for a membership. That same week, I ran into Brandon at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked in the afternoons when the apartment got too stuffy. He walked in carrying a laptop I'd never seen him use before, acted surprised to see me there, then sat at the table directly behind mine for 3 hours without ordering anything after his initial coffee. We decided to talk to the property manager after the laundry room incident. It was a Monday night, close to 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep because of a project deadline. I figured I'd throw in a load of clothes since no one else would be using the machines at that hour. The laundry room was in the basement, lit by these harsh fluorescent tubes that made everything look greenish, and you had to walk past the storage units to get there. I was loading quarters into the washer when I heard breathing behind me. Brandon was standing in the doorway wearing pajama pants and a white undershirt, holding an empty laundry basket. No detergent, no clothes, just the basket pressed against his stomach. He said he couldn't sleep either, asked if I wanted company while my clothes washed. When I said I was heading right back upstairs, he mentioned that Kevin had seemed stressed lately, wondered if we were having roommate problems, if maybe I needed someone to talk to about it. The whole time he was blocking the doorway, not aggressively, just standing there like he'd forgotten how doorways worked. I had to say excuse me 3 times before he stepped aside. The property manager, Nancy, acted like we were overreacting until we showed her Kevin's log. 3 pages of dates and times, Brandon appearing at the mailboxes whenever we checked mail, Brandon carrying groceries to his door at the exact moment we'd come home from shopping, Brandon taking out trash that couldn't have been full because he'd emptied it 12 hours earlier. Nancy's expression changed when she read about the gym and the coffee shop. She said she'd talk to him, give him a warning about respecting boundaries. 2 days later, Brandon knocked on our door to apologize. He brought homemade cookies this time, chocolate chip with walnuts, and his apology was so detailed it became its own form of harassment. He apologized for making us uncomfortable at the gym, at the coffee shop, in the laundry room at 2:18 in the morning on Monday. He knew the exact times, the exact locations, even mentioned things we hadn't told Nancy about, like how he'd accidentally walked behind me to my car after work the previous Friday, or how he'd happened to be at the same gas station Kevin used on Sunday mornings. Each apology contained information that proved he was still watching, still cataloging our movements, still treating our lives like a TV show he couldn't stop binging. Things went quiet for about a week after that. Brandon stopped appearing everywhere, stopped leaving gifts, even seemed to avoid eye contact when we passed in the hallway. Kevin thought maybe Nancy's warning had actually worked, but I kept feeling this weight in my chest whenever I came home. The silence felt intentional, calculated, like when a storm suddenly stops and you know something worse is coming. Then Kevin noticed his bike had been moved in the storage room. Not stolen, just shifted 3 spaces over from where he'd locked it. The chain wrapped differently than he always did it. I found a receipt from a hardware store tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, paid in cash, for items I couldn't quite make out because the ink was smudged. The timestamp showed it was purchased at 3:47 in the morning. We started finding these little signs that someone had been in spaces we thought were ours. A window we never opened was cracked 1/2 inch. The welcome mat was turned at a different angle. Kevin's laundry detergent was fuller than it should have been, like someone had added more to it. We installed a doorbell camera without telling Nancy. Figured we needed proof before anyone would take us seriously. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just us coming and going, the occasional delivery driver, a few other tenants passing by. But on the 4th night, the motion sensor triggered at 3:22 in the morning. Brandon was standing directly in front of our door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there facing the door like he was listening. He stayed for exactly 12 minutes, then walked back to his apartment. The next night, 3:22 again, 14 minutes this time. He never looked at the camera, kept his head tilted slightly down, but we could see his lips moving like he was having a conversation. Kevin wanted to call the police right then, but I convinced him to wait until we had more footage. We needed them to understand this wasn't just a neighbor being friendly or confused. The third night, Brandon showed up with something in his hand. He knelt down and slipped what looked like a folded piece of paper under our door, then stood up and pressed his palm flat against the door for almost 30 seconds before walking away. The paper was a printed screenshot of Kevin's Instagram story from 2 years ago, before we'd even met each other, before either of us had heard of Willow Court. It showed Kevin at some beach in California with friends, and someone had drawn red circles around everyone's faces except Kevin's. On the back, in that same perfect handwriting, it said, "They don't deserve you." We found 4 more papers throughout the day, slipped into places Brandon shouldn't have been able to access. One in Kevin's gym bag that had been locked in his car. One inside my laptop case in the apartment. One folded into the exact middle page of a book I was reading. The last one was in our freezer, wrapped in plastic, placed between 2 boxes of frozen vegetables we'd bought the day before. That one was a photo of me from high school that I'd never posted online, standing in front of my parents' house in Ohio. I hadn't been back there in 7 years. The only copy of that photo existed in an album my mom kept in her basement. Kevin called the police while I threw up in the bathroom, my whole body shuddering as I tried to figure out how Brandon could have gotten that picture. The officers who came seemed skeptical, until we showed them the doorbell footage and the photos. They took our statements, looked at Kevin's log, said they'd go talk to Brandon. We watched through the peephole as they knocked on his door across the hall. No answer. They knocked again, announced themselves, waited. After 10 minutes, they told us Brandon wasn't home and they'd try again later. But 20 minutes after the police left, we heard Brandon's door open and close. He'd been in there the whole time, just refusing to answer. That night, neither of us slept. We pushed the couch against the door and took turns staying awake. Kevin with a baseball bat he'd bought that afternoon, me with my phone ready to call 911. Around 4 in the morning, we heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside our door. The doorbell camera alert went off on my phone. Brandon was back, but this time he was holding something up to the peephole. It was another photo, this one of Kevin and me inside our apartment, taken from a high angle like it was shot from the ceiling, showing us watching TV on the couch just 2 nights earlier. Kevin lost it. He yanked the couch away from the door and stormed into the hallway, but Brandon was already gone. That's when Kevin looked up at the smoke detector mounted between our door and Brandon's. Something seemed wrong about it. The LED light that usually blinked green was dark, and the casing looked slightly newer than the one further down the hall. Kevin grabbed a stepladder from our apartment and climbed up while I held it steady. When he popped open the detector's cover, a small camera fell out and dangled by its wire. Not just a basic camera either, but something sophisticated with night vision capabilities and a wide-angle lens. We checked the other detector near the stairwell and found another one. These weren't just watching our door, they were angled to see through the gap under it when we opened it, to catch glimpses inside our apartment. Kevin called 911 while I ran to Nancy's unit and pounded on her door until she answered in her robe. The police arrived within minutes this time, and Nancy used her master key to open Brandon's apartment when he wouldn't respond. The place was empty. Not just that he wasn't home, but completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing except hundreds of photos taped to every wall. The photos covered 3 years of Kevin's life and 18 months of mine, long before we'd moved to Willow Court. Pictures from grocery stores, from previous apartments, from family gatherings we'd attended in different states. There were detailed notes written directly on the walls in permanent marker, documenting our routines, our preferences, our relationships. One wall was dedicated entirely to analyzing Kevin's workout schedule and dietary habits. Another mapped out my work patterns and coffee shop visits across 3 different cities I'd lived in. The police found Brandon's real name was Aaron Fitzgerald, and he'd been renting the apartment for 4 years, going through tenant after tenant, selecting certain ones to document. They found external hard drives with thousands of hours of footage from the smoke detector cameras and others he'd hidden in the laundry room vents and stairwell emergency lights. Nancy broke down crying when she realized he'd been doing this under her watch. We stayed in a hotel that night while the police processed the scene. They arrested Aaron 2 days later at a storage facility 40 miles away, where he'd been living in a modified unit, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from cameras he'd installed in 2 other apartment complexes. We moved out before the week ended, broke our lease without penalty, and found a house to rent on the other side of the city. Sometimes I still check doorways twice and look up at smoke detectors longer than I should, but at least now when someone knocks on our door with cookies, it's just a neighbor being friendly. The divorce had been finalized just after my 31st birthday, and finding an affordable place in a decent school district felt like winning the lottery. My daughter Lily was 7, still young enough to think moving was an adventure, and she'd spent the first week in our new house exploring every corner while I unpacked boxes. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets lined with oak trees, kids riding bikes after school, the kind of place where people actually waved when they passed you on the sidewalk. Our next-door neighbor, an older man named Harold, had introduced himself the day we moved in, bringing over a casserole dish and telling me how nice it was to have a family in the neighborhood again. Harold must have been in his 70s, thin and stooped with age, always wearing the same beige cardigan no matter the weather. He lived alone in the house to our right, kept his lawn immaculate, and seemed to spend most of his time tending to his garden or sitting on his porch with his orange tabby cat. At first, I appreciated having a friendly neighbor, especially one who seemed so harmless and grandfatherly. He'd wave from his porch when Lily played in the yard, sometimes calling out compliments about what a well-behaved child she was, how lucky I was to have such a sweet little girl. I'd smile and wave back, grateful that at least one person in this new place had made us feel welcome. The interaction started small, innocent enough that I barely noticed the pattern forming. Harold would appear at the fence whenever Lily was outside, holding a plate of homemade sugar cookies, the kind with pink frosting and sprinkles that kids go crazy for. He'd lean over the chain-link fence separating our yards, his weathered hands gripping the metal, calling out to her in that raspy voice of his. Lily would run over, delighted by the attention and treats, while I watched from the kitchen window, telling myself this was just what neighbors did in places like this. He started mentioning his cat, Whiskers, saying how lonely the poor thing got during the day, wondering if maybe Lily would like to come over sometime and keep him company. Then came the toys, little things at first. A rubber ball that had supposedly rolled into his yard months ago, a set of colored pencils he claimed to have found while cleaning his garage. Each time he'd wait until I was inside or distracted, approaching Lily directly with these gifts, always with a story about why she should have them. One afternoon, I came outside to find him teaching her how to make a cat's cradle with string, their heads bent close together, his fingers guiding hers through the patterns. The sight made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. Watching this old man's hands touching my daughter's, even for something as innocent as a string game. When I called Lily inside, Harold straightened up slowly, that permanent smile of his never wavering, and mentioned he'd be going out of town soon, wondering if Lily might want to feed Whiskers while he was gone. That evening, after Lily was in bed, I sat at my laptop with a glass of wine, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting the stress of the divorce and the move turn me into one of those helicopter parents. But my fingers typed his name into the search bar anyway, Harold Garrison, along with our street address. The first few results were nothing, some mentions in local gardening club newsletters, a photo from a community barbecue 5 years ago. But then I found it. Buried on the third page of results, a news article from 2018 about complaints filed against a Harold Garrison in a neighboring county. The details were vague. Something about inappropriate behavior around minors at a public pool, charges that were dropped when witnesses failed to appear in court. My mouth went dry as I clicked through to another link, A community forum post warning about an elderly man matching Harold's description who'd been seen taking photos of children at a playground. I spent the next hour digging deeper, finding fragments of information that painted an increasingly unsettling picture. There were 2 more incidents. One from 2016 where he'd been asked to leave a youth center after parents complained about him offering to give swimming lessons to young girls. Another from just last year where police had questioned him about loitering near an elementary school. Nothing had ever stuck. No convictions, no registered offender status, just a trail of complaints and suspicions that followed him from town to town. The wine glass sat forgotten beside me as I stared at the screen, my mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Lily, every cookie, every toy, every moment I'd left them alone together even for a second. The string game kept replaying in my head, his spotted hands manipulating the yarn around my daughter's small fingers, and I had to run to the bathroom, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and rage. After splashing cold water on my face, I went to check on Lily, needing to see her safe in her bed, her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, breathing steadily in the glow of her nightlight. I pulled her door nearly closed and went to every window in the house, checking locks, pulling curtains tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. From the kitchen window, I could see Harold's house, dark except for a single light in what I assumed was his living room. As I watched, the curtain moved slightly, and I jerked back, even though I knew he couldn't possibly see me in the darkened kitchen. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts, wondering who I could call, what I could say. The police would want evidence, something more than old complaints and dropped charges, and I had nothing concrete, just a mother's instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. Sleep was impossible that night, every small sound making me jump, every car passing on the street sending me to peek through the blinds. Around 2 a.m, I heard a door close softly, and when I crept to the front window, I saw Harold's porch light on, though I couldn't see him anywhere. I stood there for 20 minutes watching, waiting, until finally the light clicked off and everything went quiet again. The next morning, I kept Lily inside despite the beautiful weather, making up excuses about needing her help with organizing her room. Harold appeared in his garden around 10, pruning his roses with methodical precision, occasionally glancing toward our house. When Lily asked if she could go outside and play, I told her maybe later, my voice too bright, too forced, and she gave me that look kids get when they know something's wrong, but adults won't explain what. The day dragged on with painful slowness, Lily growing increasingly restless and cranky from being cooped up inside. I tried to distract her with movies and baking projects, but my attention kept drifting to the windows, checking if Harold was still out there. He seemed to be finding every possible reason to stay in his front yard, sweeping his already spotless walkway, adjusting his garden hose, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. Around 4 p.m, he knocked on our door, and I watched through the peephole as he stood there holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, that same benign smile plastered on his face. I didn't answer, holding my breath, one hand pressed against Lily's mouth when she started to ask who was at the door. He knocked again, waited, then finally left the plate on our doorstep and shuffled back to his house. Later, when I was sure he'd gone inside, I quickly grabbed the plate and threw it directly in the garbage, cookies and all. As evening approached, I made dinner while Lily colored at the kitchen table, her mood improved by the promise of ice cream for dessert if she ate all her vegetables. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when movement outside caught my eye. Harold was standing on the sidewalk directly across from our house, not on his property, not walking anywhere, just standing there facing our front door. He wasn't doing anything threatening, technically, just standing on a public sidewalk, but the deliberateness of it, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of our entrance, made my skin prickle with alarm. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the kitchen window, needing some kind of proof, some documentation of this behavior. He stood there for 43 minutes. I know because I filmed the entire time, my phone growing hot in my grip, until finally a couple walking their dog approached and he turned. walking slowly back toward his house, as if he'd just been out for an evening stroll. That night, after triple-checking every lock and moving a chair against the front door, I called my ex-husband, something I'd sworn I wouldn't do unless it was an absolute emergency. I explained everything, the research I'd found, the standing and watching, how Harold seemed to be escalating his interest in Lily. My ex listened, then said what I knew he would say, that without concrete evidence, without Harold actually doing something illegal, there wasn't much anyone could do. He suggested I install security cameras, maybe talk to other neighbors, see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. After we hung up, I sat in Lily's doorway watching her sleep, my laptop open as I ordered cameras for next-day delivery, along with new deadbolts and window locks. I dozed off there sometime after 3, waking with a stiff neck when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "She looked lovely in her pink pajamas yesterday." My entire body went rigid as I read the message again, then looked down at Lily, who was indeed wearing her pink unicorn pajamas, the same ones she'd worn yesterday morning when I'd let her grab the newspaper from the porch. I screenshotted the message, my fingers trembling as I called 911, finally having something concrete to report. The police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers who took my statement and looked at all the evidence I'd gathered. They went next door to talk to Harold, and I watched from my window as he answered his door in his bathrobe, looking confused and frail, shaking his head repeatedly. When they came back, they told me he claimed to know nothing about any text message, that he didn't even own a cell phone, just his landline. They said they'd file a report, suggested I keep documenting everything, and mentioned I might want to consider a restraining order, though without proof he'd sent the message, it would be difficult to obtain. After they left, I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed Lily, still in her pajamas, and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, leaving the cameras and locks in their delivery boxes on the porch, deciding that no house, no matter how perfect the neighborhood seemed, was worth risking my daughter's safety. We stayed at my sister's for 2 weeks while I figured out what to do, eventually breaking my lease and finding a new place in a gated apartment complex with security and key fob access, somewhere Harold couldn't just wander by. I had to explain to Lily why we moved so suddenly, settling on a version of the truth that wouldn't terrify her, just that sometimes grown-ups don't make good choices about boundaries, and we needed to live somewhere with better rules. The property management company forwarded me mail for a while, mostly junk and bills, but one day there was a hand-addressed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, taken from a distance but clearly showing Lily on our old porch in those pink pajamas reaching for the newspaper. On the back, in spidery handwriting, it said, "Such a shame you had to leave." I took it straight to the police station, added it to the file, but nothing ever came of it. They increased patrols in the old neighborhood for a while, but Harold never did anything else they could arrest him for. 6 months later, I got a call from our old neighbor across the street, a woman named Beth who I'd only spoken to once or twice. She'd found my number through the property management company, wanted to let me know that Harold had been arrested. Not for anything involving children, but for breaking into another neighbor's house while they were on vacation, apparently looking for something, though nobody could figure out what. When they searched his house, they found boxes of photographs, hundreds of them, all of children from the neighborhood spanning back years, pictures taken from bushes, through windows, from his car. They found pictures of Lily, dozens of them, including ones from inside our house that he must have taken through windows when we weren't paying attention. Beth said the detective wanted my contact information, that they were building a bigger case now, connecting him to incidents in 3 different states. I hung up and held Lily extra tight that night, grateful for my instincts, for running when every logical part of me said I was overreacting. Harold got 15 years, not nearly enough, but at least he was finally behind bars where he couldn't watch anyone's daughter through their kitchen window, couldn't stand on sidewalks planning God knows what. After splashing cold water on my face, I checked on Lily, watching her sleep peacefully with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, completely unaware of the danger living 20 feet away. I pulled her bedroom curtains closed, making sure they overlapped completely, then went through the house doing the same with every window that faced Harold's property. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband asking about weekend plans, but I couldn't focus on anything except the old man next door and what I should do about him. Calling the police seemed pointless. What would I say? That my neighbor gave my daughter cookies and had some old allegations that never went anywhere. I knew how that would sound, like a hysterical single mother making drama out of nothing. But I also knew what I'd found, and more importantly, I knew that gut feeling I'd been ignoring, that primitive maternal instinct that had been screaming at me every time Harold looked at my daughter. The decision to keep Lily inside the next day led to the kind of tantrum only a 7-year-old denied her outdoor time could produce. She pressed her face against the living room window, whining about wanting to ride her bike, to play hopscotch, to do anything other than watch cartoons and color. Around noon, Harold knocked on our door, holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, his excuse being that he'd made too many brownies and thought we might enjoy them. Standing in my doorway, he peered past me into the house, his pale eyes searching, and asked if Lily was feeling all right since he hadn't seen her outside all morning. The casual way he tracked my daughter's routine made my skin prickle with revulsion, but I managed to keep my voice steady, telling him she had a cold, taking the plate with hands that wanted to slam the door in his face. He lingered on my porch for another minute, mentioning again that he'd be taking a trip soon, just overnight, and would really appreciate if Lily could check on Whiskers, even offered to pay her $5 for the help. The lease paperwork from 2016 still sits in my desk drawer, right next to the pepper spray my mom bought me when I signed it. I just finished my master's degree that May, and this studio apartment in Portland felt like the first real step into adulthood. The building was nothing special, just a converted warehouse from the 60s with thin walls and radiators that clanged like someone was beating them with a wrench, but the rent was manageable on my salary as a lab technician at the hospital. For the first 8 months, everything was perfect. I'd come home from my shifts, usually around 7 in the evening, kick off my scrubs, and enjoy the quiet sanctuary of my own space. The only neighbor I ever noticed was Mrs. Huang across the hall, who'd sometimes leave containers of dumplings outside my door when she made too many. Then Walter moved into the unit directly below mine. I remember that Tuesday in January because I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw him for the first time, standing in his doorway watching the movers haul in a leather recliner that looked like it belonged in a hunting lodge. He had this way of standing that made him seem larger than he actually was, shoulders rolled forward, arms crossed tight against his barrel chest. His hair was thinning on top but long in the back, greasy strands that touched his collar, and when he smiled at me, only half his mouth moved, like the other side was holding on to some private joke. I nodded politely, shifted my grocery bags to one arm to wave, and immediately regretted it when he took it as an invitation to introduce himself. His handshake was damp and he held on a beat too long, telling me how nice it was to finally meet a neighbor, how quiet the building seemed, how he hoped we'd be friends. The first complaint came 3 weeks later. I'd gotten home late from a double shift, around 11 at night, and was making myself a quick dinner when I heard the pounding on my door. Walter stood there in a stained undershirt and sweatpants, his face red and puffy like he'd been drinking. He said my footsteps were keeping him awake, that I walked like I was trying to stomp through the floor, and didn't I have any consideration for the people living below me? I apologized, genuinely confused because I'd been wearing socks and trying to move quietly. But he kept going, saying the microwave humming was like a drill in his skull, that even the water running through the pipes sounded like a waterfall in his bedroom. I promised to be more careful, and he left, but not before leaning in close enough that I could smell the beer and something else, something sour like milk left out too long. After that night, I became hyper-aware of every sound I made. I started taking my shoes off in the hallway, tiptoed everywhere like I was walking on glass, even stopped using my microwave after 9. But the complaints kept coming. He'd text me at all hours, long rambling messages about how I was doing it on purpose, how I was trying to drive him crazy, how women like me thought we were so much better than everyone else. I showed them to my friend Natalie, who works security at the hospital, and she told me to stop responding, to document everything, to call the landlord. But our landlord, Mr. Jameson, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. He said neighbor disputes weren't his problem, that we needed to work it out like adults, and besides, Walter always paid his rent on time. The day I stopped responding to his texts was a Wednesday in March. I'd finally had enough after he sent me 17 messages in 2 hours while I was trying to sleep before a morning shift. I blocked his number, and for about 6 hours, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But when I got home that evening, there was a note shoved under my door, written in pencil so hard it had torn through the paper in places. He called me names I won't repeat, said I was a stuck-up princess who needed to learn some respect, that ignoring him was the biggest mistake I'd ever make. The next morning, another note, this one longer, describing in detail all the ways he could hear me moving around, like he was keeping a log of my every step. He knew when I showered, when I cooked, when I watched TV, even when I rolled over in bed. That's when I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie there in the dark, straining to hear any sound from below, wondering if he was awake too, listening to me breathe. I bought a white noise machine, but it made things worse because then I couldn't hear if someone was at my door. I started sleeping on my couch instead of my bed, thinking maybe he couldn't hear me as well from the living room. But the notes kept coming, each one angrier, more unhinged, accusing me of deliberately tormenting him with my existence. He'd slip them under the door at random times, and I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. Sometimes I'd find them when I left for work at 6 in the morning, meaning he'd been up all night writing them, or worse, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. I finally called the police on a Saturday afternoon after I found a note that made my stomach turn to ice. He'd written about how thin the floors were, how he could map out my apartment just by listening, how he knew exactly where my bed was positioned because he could hear the frame creak when I got in. The 2 officers who showed up looked bored before I even finished explaining. They said, unless he made a direct threat of violence, it was a civil matter. One of them, Officer Murphy, actually suggested I try being friendlier, maybe bake him some cookies, work things out neighbor to neighbor. They did knock on his door, but Walter didn't answer, and they shrugged and left. 20 minutes after their patrol car pulled away, I heard him laughing through the floor, this low, grinding sound that went on until I grabbed my keys and left, spending the night at Natalie's place. The tapping started the following Monday night. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe a mouse in the walls, just this soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near my bedroom. But it was too regular, too deliberate, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 like someone knocking politely on a door. I followed the sound, pressing my ear to different spots on the floor until I realized it was coming from directly under my bed. My apartment had hardwood floors with a few area rugs, and when I got down on my stomach with my phone flashlight, I could see between the old floorboards and spots. The tapping stopped the second I got close, like whatever was making it could sense me there. I stayed frozen on my bedroom floor for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, waiting, and then it started again, this time more insistent, almost playful. I convinced myself it had to be the heating system or maybe Walter banging on his ceiling with a broom handle to mess with me. But deep down, something felt wrong about how precisely located the sound was, always right under wherever I happened to be in the bedroom. I started avoiding the room entirely, grabbing my clothes for the next day and changing in the bathroom, sleeping on the couch permanently. But 2 nights later, the tapping followed me, first under the couch, then under the kitchen table when I sat there with my laptop, then under the bathroom when I tried to take a shower. It was like he had a map of my apartment and was following my every move from below, announcing his presence with those soft, maddening taps. I called Natalie, begging her to come over and listen, to tell me I wasn't going insane. But by the time she arrived, the tapping had stopped completely. That's when I remembered something the building superintendent had mentioned when I first moved in, something about maintenance access panels in each unit for the plumbing and electrical work. He'd pointed to a painted-over square in my bedroom closet floor, said it connected to a crawl space that ran between the floors, told me never to open it because it was full of asbestos or lead paint or some other hazard that would cost the owner too much to fix properly. I'd forgotten about it completely until that moment, standing in my living room with Natalie, both of us listening to the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We went to my bedroom closet, pushed aside the boxes of winter clothes and old textbooks, and there it was, that square outline in the floor, except the paint around the edges was cracked now, little white flakes scattered on the dark wood like snow, and one corner of the panel was slightly raised, just enough that you could see the black gap underneath if you looked at the right angle. Natalie grabbed a screwdriver from my kitchen drawer and we pried the panel up together, our phone's lights aimed down into the darkness. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high, filled with pipes and wiring and decades of dust, but there were clear drag marks in the dirt, fresh ones leading from the direction of Walter's apartment to directly under my bedroom. And there, caught on a nail, was a piece of fabric from what looked like the same stained undershirt he'd worn that first night he complained. We could see where he'd cleared a path, pushed aside insulation, even set up what looked like a foam pad right under where my bed would be. Natalie was already calling 911 while I stood there, staring at a notebook he'd left behind, filled with pages and pages of times and descriptions, every sound I'd made for weeks, noting when I cried, when I talked on the phone, when I breathed too heavily. The last entry from just hours before simply said, "Tonight she'll finally understand we belong together." The police found Walter in the crawl space when they arrived, curled up on that foam pad directly under my bed, with a battery-powered lantern and a thermos of coffee like he was camping. He didn't resist when they dragged him out through his own apartment's access panel, just kept saying I'd invited him, that the way I walked was a code, that my footsteps had been spelling out messages only he could understand. They arrested him for breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. And at the trial 4 months later, his lawyer tried to argue mental illness, but the notebook showed too much planning, too much careful calculation. He got 18 months in prison and a restraining order that might as well be toilet paper, for all the good it would do if he decided to come back. I moved out the next day, stayed with Natalie until I found a new place, a third-floor apartment in a building with proper security and no crawl spaces. Sometimes at night, when the upstairs neighbors walk around, I still find myself holding my breath, listening for that soft tapping, waiting for it to follow me to my new home. Finding a place we could actually afford felt impossible until we stumbled across that duplex listing in early April. My girlfriend Ashley and I had been sharing a cramped studio since she finished her nursing degree, and we were desperate for space where we wouldn't trip over each other constantly. At 29, I was finally making decent money as a tax preparer, enough that splitting rent on a 2-bedroom didn't seem like financial suicide anymore. Ashley worked rotating shifts at the hospital, 12 hours that left her exhausted, but paid well enough to cover her student loans and still have something left over. We toured the place on a Saturday morning, and within an hour we were signing papers with the landlord, an older guy named Frank, who kept emphasizing how quiet the neighborhood was. He mentioned our neighbor would be sharing the other half of the duplex, some guy named Douglas who'd been there for years and never caused any problems. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and we spent that entire weekend arranging furniture and arguing about where to hang pictures. Ashley had this collection of framed botanical prints from her grandmother that she wanted everywhere, while I just wanted somewhere to put my gaming setup without getting lectured about the mess of cables. We could hear our neighbor through the shared wall, especially at night when everything else got quiet. Footsteps creaking on floorboards, moving from room to room in patterns that seemed almost mechanical, like he was following the same path over and over. His television stayed on constantly, that pale flickering light visible through our bedroom blinds at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Ashley said maybe he had trouble sleeping or worked from home on some weird schedule. We figured everyone had their quirks, and at least he wasn't throwing parties or playing drums. About 3 weeks after moving in, we finally saw Douglas for the first time. I was hauling garbage bags to the curb on a Wednesday evening when he emerged from his side door carrying his own trash. He moved in this careful, deliberate way, like someone recovering from surgery or afraid of pulling a muscle. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a faded polo shirt and khakis that looked like they'd been washed 100 times. His hair was combed straight back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had these thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an uncomfortable size. When he noticed me, he stopped mid-step and just stared for a moment before offering this tight nod. I said hey, introduced myself, mentioned we'd just moved in. He kept nodding while I talked, his mouth slightly open like he was about to respond but couldn't quite form the words. Finally, he muttered something about keeping the noise down after 10 and hurried back inside. Ashley thought I was being dramatic when I told her the interaction made me uncomfortable. She reminded me that plenty of people were awkward or antisocial, and that didn't make them creepy. Still, I started paying more attention to the sounds from next door. The pacing happened every single night without fail, usually starting around 11:15 and continuing until at least 2 in the morning. Sometimes I'd lie awake listening, trying to map out his path through the rooms, kitchen to living room, down the hallway, pause for exactly 30 seconds, then back again. The strangest part was how consistent the timing was, like he was counting steps or following some internal metronome. During the day, we'd hear him occasionally, usually the muffled sound of his television or the microwave beeping. But those nighttime walks were constant, predictable as clockwork. One night in late May, Ashley was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until morning. I'd been trying to sleep, but the pacing seemed louder than usual, more aggressive somehow. Each footstep landed harder, and I could hear him mumbling to himself between circuits. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out words, but it was just this low, continuous stream of syllables that didn't form anything coherent. Then the pacing stopped abruptly, right in the middle of his usual route. Complete silence for maybe 5 minutes. I was just starting to relax when I heard a different sound, a soft scraping coming from inside our apartment. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening hard. The scraping continued for another minute or so, like metal against wood, then stopped. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and searched the entire apartment, checking locks, peering into closets. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. Ashley got home around 7 that morning, exhausted and ready to crash. I tried explaining what had happened, but she was too tired to really process it. Said we'd talk after she got some sleep. While she was in the shower, I decided to do another check of the apartment in daylight. That's when I went into our bedroom closet to grab a clean shirt for work. As I pushed aside the hanging clothes, I noticed something odd about the back wall. There was a small pile of white dust on the floor, like drywall powder. I looked up and found it, about eye level, partially hidden behind Ashley's winter coats. A hole, perfectly round, maybe the width of a pencil. I leaned closer and could see straight through into darkness. My whole body went cold as I realized what this meant. The hole went through our wall directly into Douglas's apartment, positioned at the exact height where someone standing on the other side could look through. I backed out of the closet, legs shaking, trying to process what I'd discovered. How long had that hole been there? Had it existed before we moved in, or had Douglas drilled it recently? The scraping sound from last night suddenly made horrible sense. I thought about all the nights Ashley and I had been in that bedroom, getting dressed, sleeping, being intimate, completely unaware that we might have had an audience. My stomach churned as I remembered how the closet door usually stayed open because the track was broken and it would slide open on its own. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the hole, the drywall dust, everything. When Ashley came out of the shower, I showed her immediately. The color drained from her face as she understood what she was looking at. She kept saying, "No, no, no," like repetition could make it untrue. We stood there in our bedroom, both of us scanning the walls, wondering if there were other holes we hadn't found yet. Ashley wanted to call the police right away, but I convinced her we should check the rest of the apartment first, document everything properly. We spent the next hour going over every inch of our walls, especially the ones we shared with Douglas. We found 2 more holes, one in the bathroom behind the toilet, another in the living room concealed behind a bookshelf we'd pushed against the wall. Each one was the same size, drilled with precision, angled slightly downward like whoever made them had been standing while looking through. The bathroom one was the worst because it had a clear view of the shower. Ashley started crying when she saw it, realizing how exposed we'd been. I felt rage building in my chest, this hot, violent feeling I'd never experienced before. This man had been watching us, violating our privacy in the most intimate moments of our lives. The pacing at night took on a whole new meaning now. Was he walking from hole to hole, checking on us like we were animals in a zoo? We called the police around 9 that morning. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy who looked fresh out of training, and an older woman who'd clearly seen everything in her years on the job. They took our report, examined the holes, took their own photos. The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, asked if we'd noticed anything missing, or if Douglas had ever tried to make contact beyond that one encounter by the garbage. We told her about the pacing, the constant television, how he'd been doing this routine every single night. She nodded like she'd heard similar stories before, which somehow made it worse. They went next door to talk to Douglas, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway, that beige sedan that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, but no amount of knocking got a response. Sergeant Martinez said they'd need a warrant to enter without probable cause of immediate danger, but they could start the paperwork based on what we'd shown them. Frank, our landlord, arrived about an hour after the police left. He looked genuinely shocked when we showed him the holes, kept apologizing and saying Douglas had been there for 8 years without a single complaint. He authorized us to break our lease immediately, no penalties, and said he'd return our full deposit that day. He also mentioned something that made my skin prickle. The previous tenants, a young married couple, had broken their lease after only 2 months. They'd been vague about why, just said the place wasn't working out. Frank hadn't pushed for details because they'd paid a penalty to leave early. Now he wondered if they'd discovered the same thing we had, but hadn't wanted to deal with the embarrassment or legal hassle of reporting it. While Frank was talking, I noticed movement in Douglas's window. Just a quick shift of the curtains. He was in there, watching us deal with the aftermath of his sick hobby. We stayed in a motel that night. Neither of us could stand the thought of sleeping in that apartment knowing what we knew. Ashley barely spoke during the drive there, just stared out the window with her arms wrapped around herself. I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that Douglas might be following us, but there was no beige sedan trailing behind. The motel room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning products, but it felt safer than our own home. We ordered pizza, but neither of us could eat more than a few bites. Ashley finally broke down completely, sobbing about how violated she felt, how she kept imagining him watching her in the shower, getting dressed, all those private moments that were supposed to be just hers. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless and furious at the same time. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Sergeant Martinez. She told me they'd gotten their warrant and entered Douglas's apartment that afternoon. What they found was worse than we'd imagined. His living room wall, the one he shared with us, had been turned into some kind of observation station. He'd mounted small monitors connected to tiny cameras he'd threaded through the holes, recording equipment, notebooks filled with detailed logs of our daily routines. The dates went back months before we'd even moved in, documenting the previous tenants' every move. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd found external hard drives containing hundreds of hours of footage, not just of us, but of at least 6 other couples who'd lived in that unit over the years. Douglas had been doing this for nearly a decade, perfecting his sick surveillance system with each new tenant. They'd arrested him on multiple charges, including voyeurism, stalking, and criminal trespass. He hadn't said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with that same blank expression I'd seen by the garbage bins. The prosecutor contacted us a few days later to discuss the case. She explained that Douglas would likely take a plea deal to avoid trial, which meant we wouldn't have to testify, but also meant he'd probably serve less time. The thought of him getting out in just a few years made me sick, but Ashley couldn't handle the idea of sitting in a courtroom describing what he'd done to us. We agreed to the plea deal. Douglas got 5 years with possibility of parole in 3, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. It didn't feel like enough, not even close, but at least he couldn't do this to anyone else for a while. The prosecutor mentioned that they'd managed to identify and contact most of his previous victims. Some of them had noticed strange things but never put it together. Others had no idea they'd been watched for months. One couple had divorced shortly after moving out. The stress of feeling unsafe in their own home had destroyed their relationship, even though they never knew the real reason for their discomfort. Ashley and I found a new apartment on the other side of town, a third-floor unit in a building with proper security and no shared walls. We had a contractor check every inch of it before we moved in, looking for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. Even now, 6 months later, I still check the walls obsessively, running my fingers along them searching for holes that aren't there. Ashley started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, and some days are better than others. She still can't shower without checking behind the shower curtain multiple times, and she changes clothes in the dark most nights. We're working through it together, but we're different people now, more guarded, less trusting. Sometimes I wake up at 11:15 and listen for footsteps that never come, my body still trained to Douglas's schedule. I know he's locked up, I know we're safe, but that knowledge doesn't stop the feeling that somewhere, somehow, we're still being watched. The detective told me they never figured out why Douglas did it. He never offered any explanation, never showed any remorse. Some people are just broken in ways we'll never understand, she said, and all we can do is try to protect ourselves from them. I think about that a lot, about how evil can live right next door, separated by nothing more than a thin wall and a few inches of insulation, pacing back and forth in the dark, watching, always watching. My divorce lawyer's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I heard the moving truck rumble up next door on a humid Wednesday morning. 6 months of staring at that empty house through my home office window had made me paranoid about every little sound at night, so seeing actual people carrying furniture inside felt like winning a small lottery. I grabbed a 6-pack of beer from my fridge and walked over around noon, figuring it was the neighborly thing to do. Michael Anderson answered the door with paint smeared on his forearm, his wife Laura behind him unwrapping dishes from newspaper, and their teenage son Justin hauling boxes marked garage up from the basement. Medical equipment sales, elementary school teacher, high school junior. They laid out their life stories between sips of beer while we sat on their still plastic-wrapped couch. Laura kept apologizing for the mess while Michael told me about their last place in Michigan, how they'd needed a fresh start after some family drama with Laura's parents. Justin barely looked up from his phone except to ask if I knew any good spots to skateboard, which I didn't, but I appreciated him trying to engage with the old guy next door who was probably his dad's age, class of '05, making me feel every one of those years since graduation. Everything about them screamed normal suburban family for those first few weeks. Michael washing his SUV every Sunday morning, Laura planting marigolds along their front walk, Justin shooting hoops in their driveway after school. I work from home doing technical writing for a software company, basically translating engineer speak into human language, so I had a front row seat to their daily routines from my desk. October rolled in with early frost warnings, and I was actually sleeping well for the first time since signing those papers that split everything down the middle. Until that Saturday night, when metal scraping against dirt pulled me out of a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning. My bedroom faces their backyard, and through the gap in my curtains I could make out this yellowish light, like from those portable work lamps contractors use. That steady, rhythmic digging sound kept going. Shk thud, methodical and purposeful. I lay there for 20 minutes trying to convince myself they were just putting in fence posts or planting a tree. But who does yard work at 2 in the morning, and why would they need to dig for over an hour straight without stopping? Sunday morning came and I expected to see fresh soil or some new garden feature in their yard. But when I casually walked along our shared fence line pretending to check my gutters, everything looked exactly the same. Michael was out there hosing down his SUV like always, whistling some tune I didn't recognize, and he gave me his usual wave with the chamois cloth in his hand. I asked him if he'd heard any raccoons last night, fishing for some explanation, and he just laughed and said they'd all been dead asleep by 9 o'clock. Laura came out with coffee for him, wearing these fuzzy slippers shaped like bear paws, and invited me over for dinner later that week. Standing there in the bright morning sun, watching them be so perfectly ordinary, I started doubting what I'd heard, wondering if maybe the sound had come from somewhere else entirely, or if those sleeping pills my doctor prescribed were messing with my head more than I realized. But then it happened again the following Friday, and this time I was ready. I'd been lying in bed since 11, lights off but wide awake, when that same scraping started at exactly 3 in the morning. This time I didn't stay in bed. I crept to my spare bedroom, which had a better angle of their backyard, and peeked through the blinds. There was Justin, illuminated by one of those camping headlamps, dragging what looked like a heavy contractor bag across their lawn toward the shed they'd installed the week before. The kid was stronger than he looked, managing that bag with steady determination, even though it seemed to weigh nearly as much as he did. Michael stood by the shed door holding it open, and when Justin got close enough, they both lifted the bag together and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, they came out empty-handed, and Michael put his hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him back toward the house while Justin kept wiping his hands on his jeans over and over again. I couldn't focus on work after that, spending my days staring at their backyard from my office window, watching for any sign of what they might be hiding in that shed. During a conference call about API documentation, I watched Laura hanging laundry on their clothesline, humming and acting like she didn't have a care in the world. Justin would get home from school around 3:30, drop his backpack on the porch, and shoot baskets until dinner, never once going near the shed during daylight hours. Michael started working on some project in their garage with the door open, sawing and hammering away at what looked like shelving units, occasionally calling Justin over to hold a board steady. They were playing the part of the perfect family so well that I began to question my own sanity, wondering if stress from the divorce had finally pushed me into some kind of paranoid breakdown. My ex-wife had always said I overthought everything, turned molehills into mountains, and maybe she'd been right all along. I decided to test them, to see if I could get any kind of reaction that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. That Wednesday, when Laura invited me for dinner, I accepted, showing up with a bottle of wine and my best attempt at normal conversation. Their house smelled like pot roast and fresh bread, with family photos covering every surface. Justin, at various ages, always with that same crooked smile. Michael and Laura on vacation somewhere tropical, everyone looking genuinely happy. We ate at their dining room table while Justin talked about his history project on the Cold War, and Michael shared stories from his sales trips to rural hospitals. When I mentioned casually that I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, hearing strange noises at night, Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth for just a second before she suggested I try chamomile tea. Michael jumped in immediately, talking about how the neighborhood had tons of wildlife, possums, raccoons, even a fox family that lived in the woods behind our street. Justin stayed quiet, pushing green beans around his plate, until his father asked him about basketball tryouts, and he launched into an enthusiastic recap of practice. After dinner, Michael offered to show me the shelving he'd been building in the garage, and I followed him out through their kitchen door, noticing how Laura's smile tightened when he suggested it. The garage was meticulously organized, tools hanging on pegboard in order of size, lumber stacked against the far wall with labels indicating length and type. Michael ran his hand along one of the shelves he'd finished, explaining his process for getting the joints perfectly flush, but I kept glancing toward the backyard, toward that shed sitting in the corner of their property like a secret wrapped in aluminum siding. I asked him what they kept in there, trying to sound casual, just making conversation, and he didn't miss a beat. Lawn equipment, holiday decorations, the usual suburban overflow that doesn't fit in the garage. He even offered to show me. Started walking toward the door, but then Laura called from inside that Justin needed help with his math homework, and Michael apologized, said we'd have to do the tour another time. I went home that night more convinced than ever that they were hiding something, and I made a decision that I'm not proud of, but couldn't stop myself from following through on. I ordered one of those wildlife cameras online, the kind hunters use, with night vision and motion activation. When it arrived 2 days later, I spent an afternoon pretending to trim the bushes along our fence line while I mounted it to a tree that had a clear view of their shed. The camera was smaller than I expected, olive green plastic that blended into the bark, and I angled it just right to capture anyone approaching from their house. That first night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour for motion alerts, but nothing triggered it except a cat around midnight and what looked like a possum just before dawn. Friday came and went with no activity, Saturday too, and I started to wonder if they'd somehow noticed the camera, if they were waiting me out, playing some kind of psychological game where they knew I was watching and wanted to see how long I'd keep it up. Monday night changed everything, and I wish to God I'd never installed that camera, never looked at what it captured. The alert came through at 2:47 a.m., and when I opened the app on my phone, the infrared image showed all three of them in their backyard. But this time they weren't heading to the shed. They were standing in a circle on their lawn, each holding what looked like a small gardening trowel, and they were digging, but not in one spot. They were making a pattern, connected holes about the size of coffee cans, maybe a dozen of them arranged in some kind of shape I couldn't quite make out from the camera angle. Laura was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas, her hair tied back with what looked like a bandana, and she kept checking something on her phone, like she was following instructions or keeping track of time. Michael had on sweatpants and a hoodie, moving between the holes and measuring distances with a tape measure, making sure everything was precise. Justin looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes between digging sessions, but his parents kept him moving, Laura touching his shoulder whenever he slowed down, not roughly but insistent, like this was something that absolutely had to be finished before sunrise. Then they started bringing things out from the shed, and my mouth went completely dry watching them work with such practiced efficiency. First came small cloth bags, the kind banks use for coins, each one tied with colored string, red, blue, yellow, green, and they placed one bag in each hole with careful deliberation. Michael went back to the shed and returned with what looked like mason jars filled with dark liquid, and they poured a small amount from each jar onto the bags, the liquid soaking into the soil. The smell must have been strong because even Justin pulled his shirt up over his nose, and Laura turned her face away each time she poured. They worked in complete silence except for the occasional whispered instruction from Michael, and I realized they'd done this before, many times, because everyone knew exactly what their role was, when to move, where to stand. After the liquid came white powder from a plastic container, sprinkled over each hole like they were seasoning food. And then finally they began covering everything with dirt, patting it down flat, making the lawn look undisturbed. I sat there staring at my phone screen until the battery died, trying to process what I'd witnessed, and when I finally got up to plug it in, I noticed movement outside my window. Michael was standing at the fence line between our properties, just standing there in the darkness, facing my house. I couldn't see his expression, couldn't tell if he was looking at my window specifically or just staring at the house in general, but he stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes before turning and walking back to his house. The next morning I called in sick to work. Couldn't imagine trying to write documentation while knowing what my neighbors had buried in their yard. Around 10 o'clock, Laura knocked on my door with a plate of fresh muffins, blueberry with a crumb topping, and her smile was so warm, so genuine, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. She asked if I was feeling all right, said Michael mentioned seeing my lights on late last night, wondered if my insomnia was getting worse. I took the muffins, thanked her, told her I was fine, just work stress, and she patted my arm like a concerned mother before heading back to her house. That afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to check the fence line where I'd installed the camera, telling myself I was just making sure it was still hidden. But when I got to the tree, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not hanging loose, just gone, like it had never been there at all, and the only evidence it had existed was a small indentation in the bark where I'd secured the strap. I stood there running my fingers over that mark, and when I turned around, Justin was standing about 10 feet away, holding a basketball, just watching me. He didn't say anything at first, just bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon, and then he asked if I'd lost something, if I needed help looking for it. I told him no, just checking for damage from the storm we'd had last week, even though there hadn't been any storm, and he nodded slowly, said his dad was good with tree stuff if I needed help, then walked back to his driveway and continued shooting hoops like nothing had happened. That night I lay in bed with every door locked, chair wedged under the doorknob of my bedroom door, telling myself I was being ridiculous but unable to shake the feeling that they were done playing games with me. Around midnight I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, followed by a gentle knock. Not urgent or aggressive, just 3 soft taps like someone dropping by to borrow sugar. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there listening as the knocking came again. Same pattern, same politeness. And then I heard Michael's voice, calm and friendly, asking if I was awake, saying he had something to show me in the shed, something that would explain everything. He waited maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard his footsteps moving away, down my porch steps, and the night went quiet again. I stayed frozen in that bed until sunrise, and when I finally worked up the courage to check my front door, there was a single manila envelope tucked into the frame. No name, no address, just sitting there waiting for me. Inside the envelope were photographs, dozens of them, all taken from angles that showed my house, my bedroom window, my home office, my backyard, even one through my kitchen window showing me making coffee. But the dates on the photos, the little timestamps in the corner, they were all from before the Andersons moved in, some going back months when the house was supposedly empty. The last photo in the stack showed me installing the camera on the tree, taken from behind, so close I could see the sweat stain on my shirt collar. On the back, someone had written in neat blue ink, "We were here first. We were always here. Stop looking or we'll have to stop being neighbors." I packed a bag that morning, threw it in my car along with my laptop and whatever clothes I could grab in 5 minutes, and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I called a real estate agent from the motel room, told them to list my house immediately, take whatever offer came first. I didn't care about the money anymore. The house sold in 2 weeks to a cash buyer who waived inspection, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too relieved to care. I signed the papers electronically, never went back to collect the rest of my things, just had a moving company pack everything up and put it in storage. Started over in a different state, got a small apartment near downtown where there were always people around, always lights and noise and activity. For months I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, heart racing, waiting to hear that scraping sound, but it never came. Slowly I started to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Maybe they were just eccentric people with weird hobbies. Maybe the photos had been taken by a previous owner or some real estate company doing market research. Then about a year later, I was mindlessly scrolling through news articles when I saw it. A story about human remains being discovered in Pine Valley Road during construction of a new development. The house next to mine had been demolished, and when they started excavating for the foundation, they found bones, lots of them, some dating back decades. The article mentioned that the previous owners, a family of 3, had disappeared without a trace, leaving no forwarding address, no trail to follow. I still think about the Andersons sometimes, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and the room is too quiet. I wonder if they're out there somewhere, living next to someone else now, washing their car on Sunday mornings, bringing over casseroles, burying things in patterns under cover of darkness. I changed my name after I moved, deleted all my social media, got a new phone number, did everything I could to disappear, but sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like Michael at the grocery store, or hear a laugh that sounds like Laura's, or see a teenager bouncing a basketball with that same steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. And I know it's not them. It can't be them, they don't know where I am. But I still leave the store immediately, still drive a different route home, still check my locks twice before bed. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't what they were burying or why they were doing it. It's that note, those 5 words that made everything clear. We were always here. They weren't the new neighbors moving in next to me. I was the one who'd moved in next to them. And whatever they were doing, whatever they were hiding, I'd gotten too close to something that was never meant to be found. There was a time when quiet meant safety to me. My house sat at the very end of a small cul-de-sac, surrounded by elm trees that rustled even when there was no wind. The neighborhood had a strange kind of calm, the kind that made every sound stand out, like a door creak or the distant bark of a dog. I'd moved there for peace after a long and messy breakup, and my days were a mix of remote work, long walks, and late nights reading by the kitchen window. I barely knew anyone until the old man next door, Mr. Henry Lawson, started showing up with a basket of muffins or pie every few days. He had that gentle, old-fashioned politeness that made me think of another era. Henry lived alone in the house across the street, the one with the ivy crawling up the porch rails and the heavy green shutters. He liked to talk about how the cul-de-sac used to be full of families, how the kids ran through the sprinklers right there, pointing at the patch of grass between our driveways. His stories were warm at first, and I liked listening. He would smile, his eyes almost hidden behind thick glasses, and talk about good neighbors, good times. But after a while, I started noticing how he always seemed to glance toward his basement door, as if making sure it was still closed every time I visited. The first odd thing happened one night in early autumn. I was closing my kitchen window when I heard a metallic clang, followed by a dull thud that seemed to come from Henry's house. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sound was so distinct that I turned off the lights just to listen. There it was again, like something heavy being dragged on concrete. I told myself maybe he was moving furniture or storing tools. But when I looked out, I saw a faint yellow light flickering through the narrow basement window on his side of the house. It went out seconds later, leaving the yard in complete darkness. The next day, I brought up the noise casually. Henry chuckled and said he had been fixing his furnace. His tone was friendly, but something about the way he tightened his grip on the pie plate caught my attention. He thanked me for checking in, then quickly changed the subject, asking if I liked pecan or apple better. I noticed his hands were rough, like someone who still did heavy work despite his age. When he walked me to the door, he locked it right after I stepped out. I heard the click before I even reached the gate. At the time, I laughed it off as an old man's habit, but that sound of the lock turning stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. A few evenings later, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw Henry outside, kneeling beside his garden shed. He was digging into the soil, carefully piling dirt into a wheelbarrow. When he noticed me, he smiled and waved, but there was something odd about how quickly he covered the hole with a tarp. I asked if he needed help, and he said it was just old pipes, his voice softer than usual. Behind him, the basement door stood wide open for the first time, and I caught a glimpse of stairs leading down into dim light. A chill went through me, not fear exactly, but a sense that I had stepped too close to something private. Later that night, it started again. Scraping, slow and rhythmic, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I pressed my ear against the wall that faced his house and waited. For a moment there was nothing, and then 3 sharp knocks echoed through the quiet like someone hitting metal. I nearly called the police but stopped myself. How would that sound? My neighbor's basement is making noises? It felt ridiculous. So I sat there, lights off, watching that same narrow basement window glow faintly again. The light swayed as if someone was walking with a lantern. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. The next afternoon I made a reason to visit, returning his pie dish. He invited me in, cheerful as always, and I immediately noticed how cold the house was. It smelled faintly of bleach and old paper. We talked in the kitchen for a while until he excused himself to check something downstairs. I waited until I heard the lock click behind him before stepping quietly toward the hallway. The basement door was heavy, reinforced with a thick padlock that looked newer than the rest of the house. Beside the door, an old framed photograph caught my attention. Several people standing on the same street, all smiling. I recognized none of them except Henry, decades younger, standing right where my house would be built years later. That night, I searched for the street name online, just out of curiosity. What I found made my heart pound. A few old newspaper scans mentioned disappearances from this exact block, 3 different people, spread over 20 years. The reports were vague, mentioning no signs of forced entry and residents last seen near the end of the cul-de-sac. In 2 of the articles, the name Henry Lawson appeared as a witness who reported unusual noises, or was among the last to see the missing person. I stared at his picture in the article. The same calm expression, the same faint smile. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the more I read, the harder that became. The next morning, I saw him standing in his yard, trimming the hedges like any other day. The normalcy of it unsettled me. I could not stop thinking about those articles. I printed them out and kept them on my table, reading and rereading the lines that mentioned his name. At one point, I glanced out the window and realized he was watching me. Not directly. His head was tilted just enough that I could see the reflection of my house in his glasses. When our eyes finally met, he smiled and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. That night, the noises started again, louder than before. Around 3 in the morning, I called the police. I told them there was a disturbance next door and that I believed someone might be hurt. They came within 20 minutes, 2 officers walking up his driveway with flashlights. I watched from my window as Henry opened the door in his robe, calm as ever. They talked for a few minutes. Then one of the officers laughed at something he said. After a short look around the backyard, they left. Henry stood there for a while after they were gone, just staring at my window before slowly going back inside. The next day, a pie tin sat on my porch filled with cookies and a small note that read, "No hard feelings, neighbor." I barely slept that week. I packed a small bag and decided to stay with a friend across town for a few days. But before leaving, I felt compelled to check something. The old police reports had mentioned a storm drain that connected several properties on our street, one entrance behind Henry's shed. I went out early that morning and walked around to the back of his fence. The air smelled damp, metallic. I found the drain partially hidden by vines and crouched down. Inside, barely visible in the dark, was the glint of a chain and something else. Fabric, pale and torn. I stepped back so fast I nearly fell, my heartbeat filling my ears. I moved out 2 weeks later. The house sold quicker than I expected, and I never went back to that neighborhood. I did call the police again, anonymously this time, and told them about the drain. Whether they ever looked into it, I will never know. Every now and then I search Henry Lawson's name online. Nothing new ever comes up. But sometimes when the nights are too quiet, I catch myself listening, waiting for that faint metallic sound that used to echo from his basement, the one that told me I was never really alone on that street. It started with something small, a cracked fence post between my yard and the man next door. I remember noticing it after a storm that had torn through the area overnight. The wooden panels leaned slightly toward my side, and when I mentioned it to him, He said it was probably my fault for letting my shrubs grow too close. His name was Howard, a retired mechanic who spent most of his days sitting on his porch with a can of beer. We weren't friends, but I had always tried to be polite. Until that day, we had never exchanged more than a few neighborly words. At first, I figured our little argument would blow over. People get touchy about property lines. I offered to split the cost of repairs, but he just walked away mid-sentence, muttering something I couldn't catch. A week later, I noticed he'd parked his old truck in a way that blocked part of my driveway. The next morning, there were dead potted plants tossed onto my lawn, their roots exposed, soil scattered like ashes. I didn't have proof it was him, but who else would do something like that? Things kept escalating in quiet, unsettling ways. The motion light above my garage started flickering every night, always around the same hour. I replaced the bulb, checked the wiring. It wasn't that. One evening, I caught him standing on his porch, staring straight at my kitchen window while I washed dishes. He didn't look away, didn't move, just stood there with this blank expression, his beer can resting against the railing. It wasn't rage on his face or even amusement. It was emptiness, like he was waiting for something. That's when I decided to call the city and report him for harassment and illegal dumping. I didn't want to, but I was tired of feeling watched. The officer I spoke to said they'd send someone by to talk to him. For a couple of days, things were quiet. Then one night, the power went out across the whole block. I thought it was just another outage, until I saw a faint shape near the fence line, standing perfectly still, right inside my backyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moonlight barely reached the backyard, but I could see enough to make out the outline of someone near the fence. I stood still by the window, hoping maybe it was a tree or a shadow from a neighbor's yard. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, closer to the house. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I didn't grab my phone right away because I didn't want to draw attention with the light. I just stayed there, watching, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. The figure stepped under the porch light, and even though the power was out, there was just enough glow from a nearby street lamp to see the jacket. It was Howard's. That same faded denim jacket he wore every day, the one with oil stains on the sleeves. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing there, facing the back door like he was waiting for it to open. I crouched down behind the counter, clutching my house keys so tightly they left marks in my hand. After what felt like forever, he turned toward the side gate. I heard the latch rattle, but it didn't open. I realized I had locked it earlier that evening. Thank God. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the side of the house, slow and dragging. My dog, Benny, started whining from under the table. He never barked, just whimpered, like he knew we weren't supposed to make a sound. I stayed crouched there, counting the seconds between each step until everything went silent again. Minutes later, the hum of the refrigerator kicked back in. The power had returned. The light flickered on, and I ran to the front window to see if he was still outside. The porch was empty. His truck was gone. But something caught my eye near the curb. A trail of wet footprints leading from my backyard to the street, faint but visible under the lamplight. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt sharper, every creak louder, and I kept picturing that jacket in the dark. The next morning, I went outside and found that part of the fence had been pushed inward again, this time splintered at the base. A muddy boot print sat right beside it. I took photos and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the prints had mostly dried, and they said there wasn't enough to go on. One of the officers knocked on Howard's door, but no one answered. His truck wasn't there either. They told me to call if he came back, though they didn't sound convinced it was serious. Maybe they deal with too many neighbor disputes to see when one is different. Over the next few days, I barely left the house. Every creak from the porch made me tense up. I started keeping a flashlight and a kitchen knife near the bed, just in case. Then, one afternoon, a city inspector came by to confirm the harassment complaint I had filed. He said Howard had been issued a warning notice but hadn't been seen at his address since. Apparently the house belonged to his brother, who told them Howard had moved out suddenly and left most of his belongings behind. I asked if that included his truck. The inspector said no. There was no truck in the driveway when they went by. For a while, things actually went quiet. The lights stayed steady, the fence untouched. I even started sleeping better. But about 2 weeks later, a small brown package showed up on my doorstep. No return address, no label. Inside was a single photo, printed on cheap glossy paper. It was a picture of my backyard, taken from outside the fence in the dark. The back door was open, and I was standing in the kitchen facing away from the camera. I called the police again, but they couldn't trace where the package came from. They suggested maybe it was a prank, and that I should install security cameras. I did. For months, nothing happened. No one appeared, no more packages. Still, every time the power flickers or the motion light clicks on, I find myself staring through that same window, expecting to see a figure in a denim jacket standing by the fence, waiting for me to step outside.